Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. I'm going to do a briefer recap. I did a series, still ongoing actually, I've got to get back to it, unlocking the Giza plateau and looking at the larger plan of the pyramids, especially those three most famous pyramids, how they relate to the Sphinx, but also to Khentkhawre's tomb or pyramid, but the calendar system which they embed and what the story that is telling, and I'll also be showing a reconstruction of the Giza plateau, the three pyramids, before the construction of the pyramids, because this important calendar cycle, the flood cycle of the Nile, predates construction. It's very, very old. It regulates the rhythm of life. So before there was a civilization and agriculture, this was already in place. So this is what I'm proposing. It looks something like, we don't know exactly. This is what it looks like now, basically from that same spot. So we have Khentkhawre's tomb / pyramid, the Menkaure pyramid, Khafre pyramid, the Sphinx there, and the Great Pyramid. And I've highlighted those names in yellow because they form part of a natural landscape, as where Menkaure does not. So these are part of a natural landscape that the main pyramids there and the Sphinx are part of something which was there before, and what's been built after is just a extension of the natural calendar cycle, archeoastronomy, and how this is the biological rhythm of life of the Egypt. So something like this would be the older view. There it is now. Something like this in the past. I'll explain why, but firstly, what is Egypt? Egypt is not the pyramids, it's not the temples. Egypt is the Nile. If not for the Nile, there would be nothing there. The heartbeat, the rhythm of life, everything that Egypt is, relies and is built on the Nile. There would be nothing else there if not for the Nile. In ancient times, actually until quite recently, up until the late 60s, ancient Egypt was the flood. The annual flood cycle of the Nile was what made Egypt possible. So there we see, just beneath the delta, where Cairo and the Giza three famous pyramids are, but Egypt is the Nile, and there we see the Nile stretching down, and then above that point in terms of elevation, but south of that there are two. There's the Blue Nile and there's the White Nile. The White Nile comes down from, basically from the Congo, where we not just have annual rainfall, which creates all these lakes and eventually rivers, but there's also snow melt from there, which feeds that, of course. But also in the highlands of Ethiopia, the Blue Nile begins with not just the rainfall, you can even see the green there, but the melting of the snows. The Blue Nile and the White Nile come together to make the Nile River, which is the artery of Egypt. There we see the Nile feeding down, but also we have the Tigris and Euphrates. Why they are important? Because they show a connect. So ancient civilizations, again up until quite recent, with major dam projects, it was the annual rain or snow melt, but the annual flood cycles which defined not just these civilizations, but the Indus civilization, China, Vinca and Varna on the Danube, for instance. Every civilization really in the past that was built on river systems was entirely dependent on flood cycles. So we see where Sumer is, and there we have Egypt with Lower and Upper Egypt. Upper is in up the river. Egypt is the Nile, the river is the spine of Egypt, and the flood is the heartbeat of Egypt. It's what made it possible. Now both Egypt and Sumer were defined by the river systems, but especially Sumer and Lower Egypt were marshlands bordered by desert. Now even the Nile of Upper Egypt, a very thin strip of agricultural land and then desert on either side. If it wasn't for this flow of water and the agriculture that it was built upon, which that was the everything about the civilization. Prior to Egyptian civilization, even just the biology, the rhythm of life of animals and nesting birds and frogs and snakes and everything was bound by and lived by this natural cycle that just defined before man, before agriculture, after the agriculture. This was everything. There was nothing without it, and without this understanding, I'd say it's impossible to really understand what was happening in these ancient civilizations. So 1970, the High Aswan Dam was completed, and now the flow of the Nile is regulated. Instead of a surge of the annual flood and then the low water mark, the Nile basically runs at a constant flow throughout the year. This was a similar effect as happened along the Tigris-Euphrates. For instance, up in Turkey, they're still building dams, which is even flooding valleys where we have some important architecture, ancient architecture, and evidence of that. But both these regions, and again, Indus or China or any civilization that exists for a very long time is a river civilization. The exception would be in Mexico, but their river is underground. It's in the cenotes, so they don't have a big above ground river, but they have a water flow underneath. If you live on the coast and you're dependent on the coast, very few coastal civilizations last a long time. Every long-lasting civilization is built on a river system. So it was in the 50s, and then in the 90s they drained the marshes, but the marshes and the rivers was just the flow of life. So whether it was the annual flood cycle in Egypt, so you can even see the flood coming right up to the base of the pyramids. Now it's about 4 or 5 kilometers away. But this was also the same in Tigris, Euphrates, so Sumer, Babylon, and these other civilizations. They depended not on annual rainfall in the region, but the water flow that come down from the melting rivers and water that was caught by higher mountain peaks and brought down as well. This was the basis of these civilizations. So whether it was a Nile, whether it was a Tigris, Euphrates, shorter distance, so their flood would have arrived in spring, as where the Nile flood arrived in midsummer, because it had to travel such a large distance to get eventually to Egypt. Annual flood cycles vital to both of these civilizations, their agriculture, their economy. Therefore, their mythology and key stories would be built around flood. Now, every once in a while, you're going to have a drought where the water doesn't flow as much. Every once in a while, you're going to have a really big flood where it inundates everything. Now, even in just a normal flood cycle could be quite destructive if you're living, especially those right next to the river. So the summer solstice is the key, because we'll show that the ancient Egyptian summer solstice marked the new year, which was the beginning of the flood season, while in Tigris-Euphrates, the spring equinox would have been the pointer in regards to the arrival of the flood. But Egypt is the Nile, the flood is everything. Without the annual Nile flood, there'd be no agriculture, there'd be no civilization, there'd be no temples, pyramids, or anything. The Nile. Water is life. So that's a natural cycle, and we also have a natural cycle of the solstice and equinox. So 2 equinoxes per year, the spring and autumn equinox. We have the summer solstice. This is based on the northern hemisphere. Of course, it's reversed down here in the south, but in the northern hemisphere, you have the summer solstice and the winter solstice, December 22. But we have the longest day of the year, summer, and we have the 2 equinoxes, the spring and autumn equinox, and the shortest day of the year. The seasons, it's everything. We'll even now, because we have long distance transport and indoor what do they call it, not aquaculture, but using artificial lights to grow, and also transporting and refrigeration, so you can get strawberries all year round. Back in the past, berries were available only during that time of year. The seasons defined what food was available, not just in plants, but also in animals. The arrival and disappearance of migrating birds. Insects would disappear during the winter, especially the frogs and snakes go into hibernation, or bears go into hibernation. The seasons regulate everything, and until very recent times, this has just been the heartbeat of life across the world. But for most parts of the world, we have the 4 seasons of a year, but Egyptians did not have 4 seasons. They defined their year by 3 seasons. But the solstice, the equinox, whether it's Stonehenge, all this ancient architecture all across the world has these alignments to solstice, equinox. It's the rhythm of life. We're going into that. So basically 180 days between winter and summer solstice, and we go 180 days back. For a couple of days on the summer and winter solstice, the sun appears to set in the same place every day, and then it gradually moves across the sky, and then we come back north and south to your arrival. This would account for why there are 360 days, but the solar calendar has 365. But so the Egyptian calendar, the Mayans, the Sumerians all had a 360-day calendar year, but, well, so 3 Egyptian seasons: inundation, flood season, the growing season, and the harvest season, unlike the 4 seasons that most people are connected to. This is what defined Egyptian life, and it's also what defined their afterlife, because it's in the pyramid texts, Book of the Dead, coffin texts, where the afterlife of Egypt is a direct reflection of the life that they lived in the mortal realm. That's why in grave sites they take with them all the tools and elements and the furniture that they used in life would be preserved. And again, the afterlife was a reflection of the life that you lived. This was important for the civilized, agricultural, temple building part of Egypt, but this system was there before. And also, whether it's hunter-gatherers or agriculture, people living in that part of the world along the Nile depended on this rhythm of the flood and then the dry season. And, well, that's embedded in the architecture. Now, all across the world, America, Europe, Asia, even down here in Australia, we have these markers: summer solstice, winter solstice, and the equinox line. However, the larger plan of the Giza plateau, I'll link the series in the description, but essentially from the northwest corner of the Khafre Valley Temple, there we have the causeway which runs off. On the summer solstice, a New Year's Day of Egypt, the sun sets right in between the Khafre and Great or Khufu pyramid. Equinox line runs along the base of Khafre's pyramid. Between there, it touches the corner of the Menkaure pyramid, and then we have this lesser known Kent Kawe's pyramid tomb. The corner of that, from the 0 point, marks the winter solstice. It forms a calendar. Egypt is the Nile, it's the flood. So there we see the dry part of the year, and there we see the drought, the flood, where the waters rise right up into the base of the Great Pyramid. Whether you're in Lower Egypt or in Upper Egypt, such as here is Thebes, we see the Colossus of Memnon, but these are now 4 kilometers away from where the Nile flows now, but before the dam come in, this was the annual flood cycle, would completely inundate that part of the world. So whether it's in Lower Egypt, the land of the pyramids, or whether it's in Upper Egypt, Thebes, Abydos, Elephantine, all these areas, there we see we're in the non-flood, and that's how it looks in the flood season. The flood is the rhythm of life. The High Aswan High Dam changed all of this. So that's the dam is just above the cataracts. In the ancient times, the cataracts were the border of Egypt. Above that would be Nubia and these other parts of the world where there was these other civilizations, cultures, and trading partners, sometimes military opponents of Lower and Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt is defined by marshes, the Nile Delta and Lake Moeris, as where Upper Egypt is that thin strip of agriculture, of working land that runs along the Nile, and then just desert on either side. Also, that would explain why there was a cultural difference between Lower and Upper Egypt. The gods were slightly different. The creation story, so you had the Ogdoad, the 8 gods of creation in Upper Egypt, or southern, and in Lower Egypt, or the northern part, you had the Ennead, the 9 gods of creation. But Lower Egypt is the land of the pyramids. focusing in on Elephantine Island, which is very important. I'll put the links to the whole series in there, but just want to focus now on Elephantine Island, and there we see the cataracts, natural border for navigation along the river, and that was the border in the past of defining Egypt. Tracing a path along the river, you see just to the Great Pyramids and Heliopolis. Follow it, and I'm only grabbing some of the bends in the rivers. It's 929 kilometers, huge distance from there just to the base of the delta. Focusing, but the important part is because the solstice and equinox cycles and how this is a constant across Egypt, and so using this, we see that's arranged at 28 degrees. Focus in that part there, we see that is also 28 degrees, creating a alignment, a marker, a calendar system which defines the summer and winter solstice patterns, especially the summer solstice, because that's the arrival of the flood. Especially, the waters would have risen. It would have been a defining feature of ancient Egyptian life for so many reasons. But if we just overlay that onto the Giza plan, we can see how that matches that particular system. This is not limited to those, because you also have Thebes, which is quite some distance from there. That was where the Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens, for instance, Karnak and Luxor temples, amongst Ramesseum and other places. Once again, all of the Nile was dependent and regulated by this flood cycle. So there we see the Colossi of Memnon. There's a photo pre-dam where we see how the annual flood cycle waters would radically alter the landscape and regulate the whole lifestyle, just to colour in where the water was. So not flood cycle, not flood season, and there comes the flood season. The annual flood season, I think it's very, very overlooked in regard, and there's a focus on the grand or the great flood. But what was defining Tigris, Euphrates, or the Indus, or ancient China, and the Nile was the annual flood cycle. That came every year, and if it didn't, they were in big trouble. And so places like Karnak had these big walls around, which would have meant they would have formed a flood defense, so it stayed dry, and it would have had quite an impressive look where these temples were in dry islands in the middle of the flood. Yes, those walls, that's called. But the summer solstice marks the beginning, or is New Year's Day, and it also marks the first day of Akhet, or the flood season. This is mentioned in the pyramid texts, coffin texts, Book of the Dead. Very important feature. But Thebes has many, many important sites. But for instance, Karnak Temple. The alignment of Karnak and Luxor is not because of the shifting of the Earth's pole or any. It's aligned to the flood season, the summer solstice, Akhet, the new year, which matches just like we see in the three Giza pyramids, even again pre-flood. You can see these now. The wall that was formerly around there was a flood defense, and when you look at the columns now, they were covered in mortar. The plasterers of ancient Egypt were a very special caste of people as well. But you can see once the wall and the doors were no longer protected, you can see where the flood level has eaten away at this plaster. That's not stone being eaten away, that's the plaster. A lot of these identified as stone carvings are actually plaster that's been put onto walls. They had quite a good plaster system, the ancients in general, not just the Egyptians. But Karnak is not only aligned to the Valley of the Kings, it's also aligned to the summer solstice. The El Bahiri has the same thing. It's aligned to the Valley of the Kings. It's also at 28 degrees. Colossi of Memnon, exactly the same thing. And well, again, this is just a sort of, now Luxor Temple points the main alignment, and then we also have it points the Avenue of Sphinxes, and then it points to the sacred part of the Karnak temple complex. You can see it's lining up there, but the avenue of the sphinxes doesn't run straight. It turns and then it turns again before it enters the temple doors. Just so happens that this turn is at 28 degrees, again aligning it to the summer solstice, which marks the flood new year and the flood cycle. We see these again across Egypt. It's just one of those things. If you don't talk to academics, as in biologists and astronomers, you're going to miss all of this. But Giza complex looking west as it is now, Kent Kaways, Khafre, Khufu, or Great Pyramid, and the Sphinx, not including Menkaura's in red because it's not part of the natural landscape. Now, for instance, the causeway there just happens to be the point where all these markers come together. There's a lot of information in regards to that. I've got more to come in the series. I'll post a playlist in the description. This very important place, not just for these angles, but also the measurements from each of these pyramids just embed so much geometric knowledge on really high levels. So let's use a time machine and try and reconstruct the past. This is on the bottom, how it looks now. And we have these three natural rocky outcrops, which is Kent Kaways, Khafre, and the Great Pyramid. And it would be something like this, of course. Not quite, who knows exactly, but we can find very good information in regards to that. I'll post this study in there on the morphological study of original hill, and we can see evidence of that. So this is one of the maps from the paper. We can see that Kent Kaways is color coded, so is the Sphinx. We also can see these topographical lines of what the the Great Pyramid was prior to construction, as well as Khufu's pyramid prior to construction. There's Kent Kaways, and you can see it's quite evident that there is construction on top, but we still have even the natural strata, the lines which define the natural, but it's the base of it is still embedded, attached to the earth. It's built from a natural landscape. Again, you can even the contours, they don't run horizontal. That's how we'll see that also in the Sphinx. If you look at the southwest corner of Khufu's pyramid, you can still see Khafre's pyramid, we can still see the natural base at the parts of his pyramid are still part of the earth. You can still see those portions. You can also see the natural strata lines in there, which is also visible in the base of the Khafre pyramid. These are part of a natural landscape. Then the pyramid was built on top of it. So we can also see the same thing on the northwest corner, north and southwest. It's still quite evident. There's a photo from Google Earth. You can't get right up next to it, but the researchers into this showed how we can still see the corner is still part of the natural landscape. This also applies to Cheops or Khufu or the Great Pyramid. That's visible on the northeast corner. There we can see there. There is possible to get even just from the Google Earth. You can still see that's part of the earth. This would also be good for the construction because it's like having well, the corners are in there to stop, makes it that much stronger. And it's an interesting point of how underneath, beyond what we can see, are there like pegs of natural rock still sticking up underneath that would also strengthen the pyramid. Also would save on some construction time as well, but I think the important part is the calendar system, which is embedded in the flood cycle, especially with the Akhet and the 3 seasons of there. Because of the passage that goes down there, they know the ground level, and they know that the passage hits bedrock before it hits ground level. So we know that there is a plug there as well, but also where the grotto is, there we also hit ground level. We hit rock before we hit the base level of the pyramid. So we can see both from the descending passage and from the so-called workers exit. But anyway, the grotto there is part of the bedrock. And there we can see some photos from inside, and of course the subterranean chamber is being carved out of a rock. But, well, there could be points on that, but I won't go into that. But what we have is Khentkaue's Khafre Pyramid, Great Pyramid, but also the Sphinx is part of the natural landscape. There are some masonry work around it, but the body of it and the head, we can even see the strata, the natural layers of rock, and how it existed before, prior to some of those restoration works. You can also see that the body of the pyramid of the Sphinx was not built up, it was carved down into the bedrock. We see the bedrock layers there, and how it forms a flat plane with the back of the Sphinx. And it's also an interesting point, what was the original head of the Sphinx, what it did look like. These are some natural formations from the Sahara Desert, limestone as well, and how limestone gets affected by especially sand, wind erosion. And these are just some examples of many very sphinxy looking type of parts that are to be found also not too far away there in the Sahara. There's another example, again just like the Sphinx, you can see where the lower part and its weaker quality stone gets blown away first. You can see how the strata also would very similar to the layers of the stone in the head, and how this higher quality stone erodes less, also because it's lower to the ground, but it's going to get more sand particles hitting it, so it'll get eroded more. But weak stone, strong stone, weak stone, so you can even see the erosion patterns. Okay, we can see those lines, the strata there. So what we have is the Khentkaue's Khafre Pyramid, Great Pyramid, and the Sphinx form part of a natural landscape. That paper in there, there's been some great work done in regards to these things, and Khafre Valley Temple, which is not, anyway, but that's the 0 point in regards to these things. But what we have is a natural landscape, and what was the original head of a Sphinx? Could it have been already natural guardian, sphinxy, heady, or, you know, whatever the creature was? Could it, that also, it was part of a natural landscape. You can see that this outcrop is above the ground level. But what we have is all the pieces of pre-pyramids having the same function of what the pyramids still do to this day, where they form a calendar system. Large observatory, where again right between those two is the summer solstice. The equinox is on the running along the southern edge of Khafre's pyramid, and we also have the corner of Khentkaue's, the natural outcrop, pointing to the winter solstice. We have a lovely calendar system going on. So there's the causeway that leads out from what's called the Khafre Valley Temple, which also has a part of it matching the causeway. And from there you have a great, very important calendar system forming the rhythm of life, which describes Egypt. So with this information we can create a reconstruction. So that's how it looks now. The 0 point would be just here on the corner. Just follow that, but we still get a close enough approximate available from Google Earth. And if we overlay it, and this would be below is what it is now, and above is an approximate of what it could look like in the past, because we know we have these natural outcrops, and just a very big approximate of, was there a head type structure there poking out before the Sphinx body was carved down? Possible to be sure without a time machine, but we can start to create a reconstruction. And so for instance, could there have been something like this head, this marking this very important point, and the occupation of this part of the Nile and the Giza plateau as well has been many artifacts. It also leads to Heliopolis, and the Heliopolis, its importance probably being the, if not one of, maybe the most important point in regards to the design of the land of the pyramids or Lower Egypt. So using that evidence of the natural rocky outcrops marking Kent Kaways, Khafre, and the Great Pyramid, we can have a look and try and show what it would be like. So there we have the view now. The course of the river has changed over time, but again, as we saw a bit earlier, when the flood does come, it extends kilometres out either side from where the current Nile flows. So we overlay, see, and turn it down a bit so we can see how that would correspond. Now, Menkaure Pyramid, the smallest of the three main Giza pyramids, does not appear, from at least no evidence that I saw, that perhaps there is a natural outcropping underneath in the center, but it's not visible from the corners. However, we start, so we have the 3 seasons of the Egyptian year: the Akhet, or inundation, or the flood season; Peret, or the growing season; and then Shemu, or the harvest, low water, the dry season. Each of those is 4 months long. They're all equal length of 120 days. 365 days per year, but of course for a couple of days at the solstice, summer, and then a couple of days at the winter solstice, the sun appears not to move. But what's called the field, or the marsh of reeds, we find this in the oldest Egyptian writings, such as the pyramid text, but even in later tombs there's an illustration of it. So on the bottom we have the flood season, where you can see even the waters have come in. There we have the growing season, and there we have the harvest season, the 3 seasons of Egypt. The afterlife of Egypt reflected the living world. Again, this is described in the oldest surviving text, and also in the imagery, of course. Inundation, or the flood season, Akhet, which marks the new year; Peret, or the emergence or the growth season; and then Shemu, the dry or low water, or the harvest season. And this is one of the features of the Giza pyramids, but as we saw it earlier, it's in Thebes, it's in Elephantine, and many other places. Giulio Magli has done a lot of work looking at the archeoastronomy of all of Egypt, including the desert regions, Upper and Lower Egypt, also down to Nubia, and has found this pattern. Very strong, very, very strong evidence for it. So here we have the summer solstice. There is the overlay where we see the pyramids and Kent Kaways as they are now. Summer solstice marks the end of the dry season, or the harvest season, and it also marks the New Year's Day is Akhet, New Year's Day on the summer. That also marks the beginning of the flood season. So we go from, now the day of the flood actually arrives, and the speed of it, I'm just making a simplified version, will change. Every year is going to be a little bit different, but the New Year's Day, summer solstice, marks the beginning of the flood season. There we see the old symbol for Akhet, with the sun setting between 2 hills or 2 mounds, and before the pyramids this would have been a feature. There we see the equinox, or the autumnal equinox. So we've moved from the solstice down to the autumn equinox. As we've now, it's going to touch the southern face of the Khafre pyramid, and then not too long after that we're going to have the end of Akhet. So the flood season comes to an end, and then we'll begin the growing season. So all the crops start to grow. That's the beginning of Peret. Then we hit winter solstice, touching the north corner of Kent Kaway's tomb. That's the most southerly position of the sun during the year, and then it's going to start moving back, and at that point where it's going to be hitting the northern side of Menkaure's pyramid, which probably was why it was built particularly there as well. Also, there could be a natural mound underneath it, but one way or the other, that's the end of the growth cycle and the beginning of the low water season, or the harvest season. we come back to the equinox, spring equinox, and then we return most northerly position of the sun, being the summer solstice, and the end of the low water or the harvest season, and then the flood arrives again. New Year's Day, beginning of Akhet, and then we repeat the cycle. This was the rhythm of life in ancient Egypt, very similar for all these riverine societies, whether it's Indus or Tigris, Euphrates, and Stonehenge, North American medicine wheels, Mesoamerica, even down like very old sites here in Australia, Nabta Playa in the Sahara, down southern part of Egypt. Is it in, or was it across the border in Sudan? But this is the, this is what defines a rhythm of life. Water is life, and the seasons is what it tells you when the animals are, when the herds are going to migrate, when the migrating birds are going to arrive, when the frogs and the lizards and the snakes are going to emerge, and the fish cycle will change as well. Agriculture or hunter-gatherer, this is the rhythm of life, and that's why the flood is so important. And the annual flood cycle is a very, very important feature. Surely there were big catastrophic floods that would have had an effect, but across all of these cultures, not just in Egypt, this, and even until the modern day, before large canals and dams and more modern water management, agricultural systems, this was the rhythm of life. So I think this is a very, very important feature to consider. And what could be more important than this actually? What is more important? The sun, the moon, nature, natural cycles. I can't really think of anything that would be more worthy of building monumental structures again. So whether it's the stone circles, these dolmen, and all of this ancient architecture, this is the core theme that resonates throughout them. And doesn't matter what type of lifestyle you have, this is how what nature insists upon. And so surely there were major events, catastrophes, but it was this yearly cycle, which is, at least amongst the alternative communities, rarely, if ever, spoken about. There is a search for the big flood, the big cataclysm. Well, yes, let's look at those things, but let's not ignore the fact that this is what defined life every year, year after year after year. This could not be forgotten. If you forgot about this, you were done for. Maybe surely there would have been memories of catastrophic events, but also this annual flood cycle, if it was too big, it would be destructive. If it was too low, it would be also famine as well. So I would argue very strongly that it's actually this flood cycle, which is the one which is most important, most relevant, the one that most defines the way that their lifestyle was, their civilizations were built on these things. And I think it's very, very important to consider this, because also we see the same thing in the afterlife of Egypt followed the same yearly flood, growth, harvest season of afterlife equals the mortal life. It's written in all the important texts, the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and even the Book of the Dead. It's clearly illustrated as well, and it's just a natural biological fact that this would have to be. If you're not paying attention to this, you don't really have much at all. So there's just look again at those reconstructions, and also why this particular site would have been so important, that from this particular point of observation, that the natural mountains hills were already encoding this, and this is why you would want to build on top of it. Why build here? Why build like this? Well, why why else? Where else would you do it? I would say that this is be one of the major reasons for it. And of course, this same pattern and these angles regarding the solstice, all up and down Egypt, all up and down Tigris, Euphrates, Mohenjo-Daro, the cultures of ancient China, they're river cultures. They're based on flood cycles. Now modern dams, canals, weirs have changed this. They've regulated the water, but throughout human history, this would have been the cycle which defined life, which made everything happen, which civilization was built upon. Hunter-gatherers would have been just as dependent on it as well, even if not more so, because they didn't have big grain stores to get them through the lean part of a year. And there you go. Anyway, hope you enjoyed and have a good one. Think about the flood in a different way.